I am Jackeline Stewart-Hopkins, Edelman's head of U.S. Multicultural Communications, filling in for Lisa on today's installment of her LinkedIn Live series, Recast. As many of you know, here at Edelman, we study trust extensively. It's what we do, how it's earned, how it's maintained, how it's lost. We've been researching this most valuable currency for over 20 years. And last month, we released the annual 2022 Trust Barometer. This month, we're diving deeper into the 4 institutions that we study in this annual report. Most recently, Lisa talked about business with leaders from the Personal Care Products Council. This week, we're focusing on government, which is a favorite subject of mine, given my past position as an Obama administration appointee. We're so honored to be joined by U.S. Congressman Ami Bera, who represents California's 7th District, which encompasses most of Sacramento's eastern and southern suburbs. Congressman Bera has been in Congress since 2013 and is currently a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me on, Jacqueline. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit before we became live here for these folks. We talked about your perspective and how your previous position as a doctor, your experience, your background in medicine actually has helped inform your approach in government today. I wanted to kick off there to just set a barometer for the conversation.
Yeah, so core to our training is doctors is not to be judgmental, but to ask questions, to gather information, to try to understand the perspective of our patients, and then working with our patients to try to guide them along and give them options. And I think that's the approach that I take to my colleagues in Congress. I'm a Democratic member of Congress from, as you said, the Sacramento area, and I'd never run for public office before, so it is totally different than the practice of medicine. But you see 435 people in the House of Representatives from every district in this country, and we're all a reflection of our constituents. Otherwise, we wouldn't get reelected. And that diversity that you see in Congress, that division that you see in Congress is really reflective of some of the divisions that you see and segregations that you see across the country. And again, when let me use a member of Congress like Marjorie Taylor Greene. We have very different views on the world, but I have to accept that her constituents elected her, and she's probably reflecting a very different community than my community.
Right, and having those conversations is what allows us to sort of reach the common ground that we all need. We know that government was the most trusted institution just as recently as May 2020 during the start of the pandemic, but it's dropped about 13 points in our latest report, from 65% of our respondents saying that it's the most trusted institution to 52%. Are you surprised at all by this change? I know you mentioned the divisions.
I have to say I'm not surprised, and I think part of that is the backdrop of the pandemic. Right. I mean, the last 2 years have been incredibly hard on our country as well as the world, and specific communities have been impacted. Communities of color and others. I do think some of the messaging coming out of the White House early on, if you look at President Biden's numbers, when we were getting shots in arms, because July 4th message of we're taking our masks off and we're going to get our lives back, and then the Delta wave hit. And I just think that, going back to the beginning of the pandemic under the Trump administration, there were just so many mixed messages that were out there that, it created confusion, it created tensions. And then you had 50 state governors deciding to do their own thing, and there was no coordinated federal response. So I just think that certainly has weighed on how people see the federal government and government in general, just because there's so many mixed messages. And for something like the pandemic, it's a virus. We should have all been in this together as the United States of America, working together with one another, but that clearly wasn't the case.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned sort of the mixed messaging, and how much of this mistrust do you feel was self-imposed, right, rather than circumstantial?
Yeah, I think there are certainly missed opportunities. You know, the CDC's come under criticism for giving mixed guidance or often being late to provide guidance. And I'll use an example. You know, I've been doing a number of interviews now, and again, putting my doctor hat on, saying it's time for us to end the pandemic and start to go to endemic COVID, learning how to live with COVID-19. Because the reality is, we all know COVID-19 is not going to disappear. We're going to have to learn how to live with this. I think the public is already there and is ready to move in that direction. You're seeing governors, particularly Democratic governors, starting to move in that direction, but you haven't seen the administration get there yet. And I was doing an interview this morning and they asked me why, and I just think they've been overly cautious. And that may go back to the declaration back in July of let's take our masks off and get our lives together. I want to get our lives back. And when I say we're declaring the pandemic over, it doesn't mean COVID's not going to be with us. It doesn't mean we won't see new variants, potentially variants that elude our vaccines. But we now have to learn how to manage that. And we've learned a lot of this. And I think that would be meeting the public and individuals where they are right now.
Yeah, just even hearing your answer to that question has given me a lot more confidence than I've had over the past few weeks with everyone I know who is dealing with COVID. Our research shows that it's not just government writ large that's struggling with the trust issue, but it's also individual government leaders, right? A one-to-one. Beyond partisan gridlock, what are some of the other major factors contributing to this sentiment on an individual basis?
I touched on this a little bit. I think we've segregated as a nation. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the coast, the big cities, those are very blue, and more Democrats are congregating on the coast than in the big urban settings. And then if you look at rural America, that map looks very red. So more Republicans are congregating together. Whereas, 30, 40 years ago, I think you had more mixed communities where folks were surrounded with people who may have had a difference of opinion and a different perspective. I also think, this gets amplified with the media and, the internet. And what I mean by that is, when we were kids growing up, we were a Walter Cronkite family. So we watched the CBS News, but regardless of which of the 3 or 4 stations you watched, it was pretty much the same news. That's probably not the case today. If you go to Fox versus MSNBC or CNN, you're going to hear something very different and different perspectives, which probably reinforce what you already believe. So you're not exposing yourself to contrary opinions. Instead, what you're doing is just reinforcing, potential beliefs that you had initially, and that probably then gets amplified based on social media, what internet sites you go to. And I don't know the answer to how we break that. I also think the other area that amplifies the divisions is the media. I think the media, whenever you'll see me on cable news, it's usually to talk about policy. I'm not a bomb thrower. I'm not looking to get likes on my social media posts. I'd rather deal with the policy, but the folks that get on there are the bomb throwers. That's who you often will see, the folks that are gonna be more divisive. And I don't know how you combat that, because that probably also is where the ratings come from. But that is leading to some of the divisions.
Yeah, you've managed to break through, though, and you appear on cable news outlets that don't necessarily have a posture of agreeing with you and your stances. What else are you doing to sort of break through this division?
Yeah, so I think it's important for me. I will go on Fox News whenever I can, because it is important to present that other perspective. And again, I'm not looking to get in a fight. I'm going to hold my ground, but I'm going to present my perspective, understanding that many of the viewers may see things slightly differently. Just was invited to go to the American Enterprise Institute's annual meeting, and it's the who's who of the Republican Party. There'll be a handful of Democrats speaking there, but I think it's very important for me to go to present, as one of the keynotes. Here's how I'm viewing issues of foreign policy, and and the truth is, I actually think we're less divided as a country. I think most people just want to go to work, get their kids to school, take care of mom and dad if they're aging, pay their bills. And that's where the vast majority of the country is. They want us as the government to understand the challenges that they face, and present a context of opportunity. Right now, the number one issue when you look at polling data is people's concern about inflation, about supply chains. They're not necessarily blaming Democrats or Republicans. They are frustrated because they feel like government is not understanding the issue and doing enough to address that issue. And I think that's the disconnect. We are doing a lot to try to address supply chains and the like, and I don't think we're communicating it very well.
Do you think that, there's a generational divide that's at play here as well? I know you mentioned regionally, there are definite sort of distinctions when it comes to red states and blue states and where they lie. But do you think that, age and, where you land on the generational scale matters?
I think there is. I think when you look at the younger generation, issues of race, sexual orientation, of gender equity are very different than, let's say, the generation of boomers that may still see those things from a different perspective. They're still there, but I think when I think about my daughter, who's 24, she just grew up in that environment. I also think there's probably gender struggles. And what I mean by that is, when prior to running for Congress, I was dean of admissions at UC Davis's medical school. And for at least the last 2 decades, 60% of the students that we're admitting are women. And that tracks back to, 60% of all undergrads are women. And I truly believe the 21st century is going to be a feminine century, because you have this educated workforce, going out there. I do think there's some pushback from males that feel like they're losing power, losing that sense of control. I think we'll have to work through those tensions, but it's inevitable. If 60% of who's going to college and going to grad school are women, they're also the next generation of future leaders. I actually, as a father of a daughter, I think that's a great thing that men have screwed it up. Let's see. I think women leadership will view the world slightly differently than the male leadership of 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of diversity, right? It's the coming together of different perspectives is what leads to better outcomes. We know that for business. We are not there with government. Why do you think that we are so slow to adopt to a diversity of perspectives in government?
It's starting to change, and unfortunately, it's certainly the Democratic Party within Congress is extremely diverse, and you've seen record number of women get elected. But what was interesting is if you look at the Republicans who were elected in 2020 to Congress, a large number of women and a relatively large number for the Republican Party, individuals of color. If you look at the candidates that they're starting to run, more women, more individuals of color. So I do think it's taking time, and it's probably lagging behind the business world, but it is starting to happen. And some of that's probably just, when you run for office, you're really putting yourself out there, and if you don't see as many people that look like you, you might not think, hey, can I do that? And when I first ran, a lot of people said, well, you've never run for office. How are you going to get elected, and so forth? And it's like, well, Barack Obama just got elected, so I certainly can put myself out there and see what happens. And when I first got elected, I was the only Indian American member of Congress, and I recognize, I don't consider myself a role model, but I do recognize that I'm a role model in the sense that I want other South Asians and AAPI members to think that, hey, if he could do it, I could do it too.
Yeah. And do you feel like there's enough of that reaching back and pulling forward?
I think it's starting to happen. I think, certainly as you touched on, there's a generational shift, and I certainly see it in the 10 years that I've been in Congress. The folks that are running, not just for Congress, but also for state office or local office, are incredibly diverse.
Yeah, it's exciting. I hope to see it even reflect the way our country looks more and more. Despite growing feelings of distrust, most people still expect the government to lead and the fight on major societal issues, including the pandemic, which is where we started today. So 74% said that they want folks to lead on COVID. 65% said climate change. We have 61% on systemic injustice and discrimination and 53% on workforce reskilling. What issues are you hearing from your constituents most often?
I mean, right now, it really is the economic piece of it, and some economic insecurity when you're out there and folks go to the supermarket and they're looking for, let's say around the holidays for turkey and they can't find it. Those are real issues when they're trying to fill up their gas tank and they're paying $5 a gallon out here in California. Those are real bread and butter issues, and I think it's those bread and butter issues. So that's a component of it. For parents of school age children, it's that uncertainty. Can my kids go to school? Can they not? And I'm grateful that our daughter graduated college right before the pandemic, but I can only imagine if you had 1, 2, 3 school age kids that were now out of school and you're a working mom, a working dad, and trying to figure out how to navigate that. I think that's been a real issue, and the messaging around that's been really mixed. So how do we get our kids back in school and keep them in school and keep them safe along with the teachers and staff? And I think that's, it's just those everyday issues that I think people are, they're just trying to live their lives.
Yeah. And I think that the socioeconomic discussion is one that can be a unifying discussion, right? We all go to the grocery store. We all need food to put on our tables. I've seen my bill go from $120 a week to feed 2, sometimes 3 people, to now edging toward $185 to $200. How are folks supposed to contend with that?
Yeah. And again, that is the reality. And I feel folks' frustration or lack of trust with government is we're not talking about it enough. And there's not going to be an easy fix because of supply chain issues, of labor issues, but we've got to talk about it. And we've got to acknowledge what people are feeling. President Clinton was famous for saying, "I feel your pain." But you've got to have that empathy. And I think that's something that I try to do with my constituents. And I certainly hope most of my colleagues do that as well. But then we also have to have concrete policies that start to address those real issues. And, again, I think people understand we're in this pandemic and we're coming out of this pandemic and there's been real disruptions. They just want to have a sense of how do I get my life back and when does this end?
Yeah, Lord knows I do. We've heard you talk about some of those concrete solutions that people want to see. What are some legislative actions that you want to see prioritized in 2020?
Yeah, so I actually think we've done a lot in Congress. Going back to March when we passed the American Rescue Plan, that was a big deal because what it did do is it pushed a lot of resources to cities, counties, states all across this country. Built up the vaccine supply and got shots in arms. But it really was foundational to try to set the stage for us to start moving forward. The bipartisan infrastructure bill is the biggest infrastructure legislation we've ever passed in the history of this country. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a major investment in our competitiveness in the 21st century. We're not talking about it enough, and we need to be out there talking about the jobs it's going to create, how it's going to make us more competitive, how we'll be able to modernize education, but also deal with issues of equity. Because what we've also learned is, people had different levels of access. Let's say telehealth, telemedicine, remote learning. We've got to address those issues. Making sure broadband is available to everyone. It also starts to lay the foundation for us to move towards renewable energy, electric vehicles, et cetera, and accelerate some of that. And then the last piece of legislation, which we passed out of the House last week, the America Competes Act, which will then get conferenced with the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act that was bipartisan out of the Senate. That's also an investment in what we did in the 50s, 60s, 70s in terms of investing in R&D, bringing manufacturing back to the United States. So if we could send a positive message like that we're going to create more jobs, we're going to create better paying jobs, we're going to invest in education so our kids, as they're graduating high school or college, have a skill set to fill those jobs, and America is going to be back. I think the public would grasp that, along with it's time to end the pandemic and let's get on with our lives and learn how to live with COVID so we don't have to go through this any longer.
You just mentioned some major pieces of legislation that we were able to make happen. And you're right, we don't hear enough about it. I've been lamenting with friends and colleagues, like, where are the Instagram memes about this? Why haven't there been government generated sort of quotables or tweetables to make people understand how this is going to impact their daily lives? What is it going to take for government to sort of catch up to the way people are ingesting information today?
So I think the first 6 months of the Biden administration, they did a good job of putting out that optimistic message. Then August happened, and the withdrawal from Afghanistan wasn't great. The optics didn't look great, and then we got bogged down in process of the Build Back Better Act and passing the budget. And legislation's slow, and that's probably a good thing. That it takes time and it takes negotiation, but that's what the media covered, and I don't think we spent enough time, going out there talking about what. Giving that optimistic vision. I think you're starting to see a shift, with the president. Certainly, I would hope every member. I'm out there in my district, talking about the issues that people care about. Here, again, it's the bread and butter economic issues, but also homelessness is pretty bad in California right now, and people see that. So we've got to come up with solutions. To address that issue, issues of crime. People are talking about that. I think you're in New York. You see Mayor Adams, certainly, trying to meet people where they are, and I think that's the key to rebuilding trust. Is, again, most people don't expect government to solve all of their problems, but they do expect us to understand the challenges that they face in their lives.
Yes, we'd love to see a lot more understanding. I'm actually in Maryland, but definitely a New Yorker. So thanks for pointing that out. Crime is huge right now. It's a huge topic, and there's a debate on, is it overblown? Is this accurate? Why is there such a focus on it? And so hopefully we'll see, some messaging to address that soon, so that folks can understand where we stand. What do you think businesses should be doing to work with you better on these issues? You talk a lot about wanting to find solutions. How can business partner with you to do that?
I think business and government have to work more closely together. The world's changed rather rapidly in the last 20 years. So let's just take the technology sector or social media, information and disinformation. You don't want Congress to write sweeping legislation without necessarily understanding how that's going to impact a really big part of our economy. You want to partner with business to say, okay, here's what we'd like to accomplish. Disinformation is very real, and it certainly feeds into this distrust and division in America. How do we combat disinformation? Work with us on writing the right regulations and putting up the right guardrails without being overly restrictive. right? If we're left to our own, we're probably going to err on the side of being overly restrictive, which may really impact the business model. On the flip side, if business is just left to do whatever they want, driven by quarterly profits, they're not going to have any guardrails. So we've got to find the sweet spot. And that only comes from business and government working together and acknowledging that, yeah, there's a challenge and we need to fix that challenge. Now let's figure out how to get those guardrails, in the right place.
There's no way to understate how rampant disinformation is. And there's sort of a pipeline. You can watch it grow from one account to the other. We've seen a study where, we found accounts that were not really owned by the account manager that it was attributed to, right? What can we do outside of policy to combat disinformation?
Well, so I think it has to start with the companies owning some of that. I'm not a tech guy, but I'm told that the algorithms will, if you're going to certain sites, they'll continue to push, more disinformation in your direction. I think of it as a national security issue as well. Obviously, it undermines our democracy. I was in Kiev a couple of weeks ago, meeting with the leadership in Ukraine, and what was it? They were asking for a lot of assistance, but President Zelensky's number one ask was to help with cybersecurity, because there's a real concern. The Russians obviously have done cyber attacks on Ukraine and other countries, and there's a real concern that maybe there isn't a kinetic invasion, but there is an invasion through that does undermine the government. And I think that's where, if we have to do it by ourselves as the government, we're going to be very restrictive. Mm-hmm. And I would urge business to partner with us to figure out, how do we do this? How do we protect ourselves? How do we protect against disinformation? Because they do not want Congress doing it on their own, because it really will be, the pendulum will be way over here.
What do you suggest to businesses who do want to take action, who do want to partner with the government? How do we go about that?
I'd say reach out to your members of Congress, and particularly the ones that are on the relevant committees. Don't wait until they start legislating, but if you come in proactive and say, and acknowledge the challenge, and understand that it is going to change your business model, but you're going to have to meet the regulatory bodies halfway. And it's much better to be engaged in that conversation on the front end than after someone's written a bill. And I think that's what I've seen in the business community far too often. It's after legislation's been introduced that then they start engaging to try to kill the legislation, as opposed to, like, the social media companies have to understand that this is a very real issue. Don't wait until someone's written a bill, because then it's much harder to stop that bill. Instead, get engaged now and help partner to write that bill in a way that addresses the issue, but doesn't necessarily hinder the business model.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me how much your counsel sounds like the counsel that we try to give to our clients, right? Be proactive, right? Don't wait until your consumers or your partners have something to say. Get out in front of the issues.
And that brings up another issue that, again, I've talked to a lot of corporate CEOs about, is shareholder activism, right? There's such tremendous pressure on businesses today to show quarter after quarter increasing in profits. That's short-term thinking, but that is the pressure that doesn't allow them to change their business models to address some of these very real issues. And I think every CEO in America would be thrilled if we could reduce shareholder activism and instead get back to the days where companies were being built for the long haul and were very profitable companies, but they didn't have that pressure of having to show profit every quarter. That pendulum will come back. That's another area where don't wait for Congress to legislate that, because that's, instead, let's try to figure this one out together.
That's the theme of this conversation. Let's figure it out together. Thank you so much for joining us today. I loved our conversation, and we could have gone on for so much longer. So I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day.
Great. Thank you. Be well.
You too. Take care.